In one experiment, this researcher found that about half of the New Yorkers he observed waiting in line would not do or say anything when someone else cut in front of them. In another study, this man, along with Bickman and Berkowitz, asked what would happen if a stranger stood on a busy street looking up at a building. In yet another experiment, he sent letters out to random people to see how long it would take to forward them back to himself. That experiment formed the idea of 6 degrees of separation. For 10 points, name this Yale social psychologist who conducted a famous obedience experiment to examine the extents to which people would follow the command to administer increasingly powerful shocks to actors. And the answer is Stanley Milgram. Unlike his students, this man believed the influence of language on thought to be of minor importance only. Due to his tone deafness, this researcher had difficulty studying a tonal language in Laguna, New Mexico. This man, who studied physics and geography in graduate school in Germany, became interested in his most well known field of influence after taking an expedition to northern Canada, where he encountered and became fascinated with the Inuit culture of Baffin Island. This anthropologist spoke out against the ideology of scientific racism and introduced cultural relativism as an alternative. For 10 points, name this Columbia professor who created a 4-field subdivision of anthropology and taught Edward Sapir, Ruth Benedict, and Margaret Mead. And the answer is Franz Boas. One experimenter demonstrating this phenomenon involved the case of a stolen beer. Another experiment confirmed that the Ringelmann effect contributes to this phenomenon. Columbia University students were asked to complete a questionnaire while a room filled with smoke in an experiment observing this phenomenon. This effect was first outlined by Bib Latan and John Darley, who argued that the phenomenon may result from a diffusion of responsibility. Good Samaritan laws attempt to reduce this phenomenon, which gained notoriety after the murder of Kitty Genovese. For 10 points, name this psychological effect that posits that people in a large group are less likely to help someone during a crisis. And the answer is bystander effect. The text Rhetorica ad Herennium outlines the method of loci, which relates to the enhancement of this concept. An experiment conducted by Elizabeth Loftus found that this concept is affected by differences in word choice, such as the words collided and smashed in describing a car crash. The decay of this phenomenon over time can be modeled with the Ebbinghaus curve, and priming is cited as evidence for the existence of the implicit type of this process. The Atkinson-Shiffrin model introduced the idea of the working type of this concept, which George Miller proposed had a capacity of 7 plus or minus 2. For 10 points, name this phenomenon that is impaired in amnesiacs and includes types such as short-term and long-term. And the answer is memory. This concept traces its roots to the writings of 14th century philosopher Ibn Khaldun. Empirical studies have found that the optimal point on this concept occurs at a 70% tax rate, while other studies claim the optimal point on this thing is at 32%. This concept was popularized after it was drawn on a napkin during a meeting in 1974 by its namesake author. This concept was rooted in the supply-side school of economics and was used to justify the Kemp-Roth tax cut of 1981 and Reaganomics. For 10 points, name this economic concept that illustrates the relationship between tax rates and government revenue. And the answer is Laffer curve. This man analyzed the literati within the officialdom in his work The Religion of China, Confucianism, and Taoism. This man described the three ideal types of leadership as charismatic, traditional, and legal in a work that described the state as the only human community which lays claim to the monopoly on the legitimated use of physical force. That work is the 1919 essay Politics as a Vocation. This sociologist lamented how the cloak of care for external goods had become an iron cage of bureaucratic rationality, and he also argued that Calvinism influenced the development of market economies. For 10 points, name this German author of Economy and Society and the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And the answer is Max Weber. Albert K. Cohen's subcultural theory of this phenomenon states that it can arise from frustration and reaction formation in lower classes. Michel Foucault argued that a certain reaction to this behavior came from a certain mechanism of power that viewed it as a declaration of war. Levitt and Donahoe argued that the legalization of abortion led to a decrease in this behavior. The broken windows theory argues that controlling and preventing small-scale variations of this behavior will lead to a decrease in the more serious type. For 10 points, name this action of violating the law which may be prosecuted. And the answer is crime. This thinker outlined the problems with attaching the Indian rupee to the gold standard while serving on the Chamberlain Commission. This man said, in the long run, we are all dead. He argued that the harsh reparations put on Germany in the Treaty of Versailles would be disastrous in the economic consequences of the peace. This thinker advocated for governments to pump money into the economy during a downturn to buffer the effects of the boom and bust cycle. For 10 points, name this British economist who advocated deficit spending. And the answer is John Maynard Keynes. This man argued in one of his works that guilt over the killing of a relative of Akhenaten in the wilderness inspired Judaism. This man argued that the interaction of thanatos and libido produced all the variations of human activity. This author of Beyond the Pleasure Principle vividly described Irma's injection in another one of his books, and he developed the distinctions between the id, ego, and superego. For 10 points, name this Austrian author of Civilization and Its Discontents and the Interpretation of Dreams who founded psychoanalysis. And the answer is Sigmund Freud. Alesina and Summers found that this phenomenon decreases as central bank independence increases. The Mundell-Tobin effect suggests that the rate of this phenomenon will rise faster than interest rates. It is represented by pi in the Fisher equation. To combat this phenomenon, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised the federal funds and prime rates intentionally, causing a recession. Robert Gordon's triangle model of this phenomenon adds a built-in component along with supply shocks to the short-term Phillips curve model. For 10 points, name this increase in the overall price level. And the answer is inflation.